Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My guest today is Mr. Tom Haueter, who's a former NTSB investigator, and together with Tom, today we'll talk about 9/11. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for your time, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Tom, before we start talking about this very peculiar investigation, probably the biggest in the history of the NTSB, I think it's better if you introduce yourself and tell my viewers something about your background. Actually, it's the second time you are my guest here, because the first time you talked about the deadly crash of the helicopter of Kobe Bryant. Today, we're talking about something different, but still, if you could tell us something about who you are and your background and so on, that would be very useful.
Tom Haueter. I'm an air safety investigator. I spent 28 years with the NTSB. I was the director of aviation safety for 6 years. I'm an active pilot. I have my own airplane, an old one that I restored, and I'm restoring another airplane. So I'm kind of actively involved in aviation and still do consulting for aviation safety and accidents as they come up. But fortunately, that's quite rare.
And what was your role in 2001 or during the 9/11 investigation?
Well, the 9/11 investigation was an FBI investigation. It was very clear immediately that this was criminal intent. And therefore, the FBI took the lead. The NTSB supported the FBI investigation of all 4 sites. Essentially, the NTSB has a lot of aircraft experience. So identifying parts, helping to search for the recorders, whatever information we could help the FBI with, that's what we did. But it was an FBI investigation because it was a criminal case, which the NTSB does not do.
Okay, that's very clear. So let's start talking about the World Trade Center, which is probably the most famous crime scene of 9/11. In my understanding, the World Trade Center is the only accident. I know it's not an accident, but let me use this word to make it easy, in the history of aviation in which the black boxes were not found. How did this impact the investigation?
Well, we've had cases where one or another of the black boxes weren't found or damaged. In this case, it really didn't impact it all that greatly from the NTSB point of view, because we had a lot of radar data. With the towers, we had a lot of video data. And so we could determine the speed of the aircraft, the angles, we knew where they came from. So we had a lot of information along those lines. Clearly, we didn't have the cockpit voice recorder, which would have been interesting to hear what the saboteurs were talking about, what they were doing, anything else happening there. So we missed those, but clearly this was an intentional act, and therefore we knew there were no aircraft issues. The aircraft flew accordingly. We could see them maneuvering, so there were no airplane issues. This was strictly, people intent on maximum destruction using an airplane as the vehicle. So while we didn't have the recorders, and both us and the FBI would have loved to have had them to do more data analysis, it really didn't hamper understanding what happened here.
Well, in this case, what happened is also that we know very clearly what happened, okay? The airplanes flew into the 2 buildings, but still the engines were thrown very far away from the crash site. Is it common in airplane accidents to have the engines thrown so far?
It's not unexpected in this case. The airplanes are traveling quite fast. They were way above normal landing speed. Landing speed would be around 130 knot range. These airplanes were approaching impact around 300 knots, a little faster. And so you have engines that are very heavy and dense. It's a lot of metal in a very relatively small area. And so when they hit the buildings, and these buildings had a lot of glass, essentially engines went through them. And I know there's one photograph where you can see one engine departing the building, like smoking and going through. That inside, unless it hit a major support structure or something else, these engines are so dense, so heavy, traveling at that speed, it's going to take a lot to stop them. And in this case, the engines kept going. In a normal accident, usually you're slowed down or the angle of impact is quite great. With here, you have a much higher speed and it's essentially a straight impact. So you don't have a lot of ground resistance. The Pentagon is a little different story, but with the World Trade Centers, there wasn't a lot to stop these engines once they hit the building. They're very dense pieces of metal, very going quite fast. So they're going to keep on going.
Well, what happened at the World Trade Center was actually very clear and straightforward because we saw it on TV. Everyone saw it on TV. So what were you guys at the NTSB investigating?
Well, essentially, we didn't do much of an investigation from the NTSB point of view because we knew what happened. What we're trying to do is support the FBI. And so we did radar analysis, we did speed analysis, we did some trajectory analysis to show, okay, here's how fast they were going, here's the angles, help if that could be helpful to them. We also went on site to identify airplane parts. We spent a lot of time helping to search through rubble to look for the recorders, which unfortunately weren't found. But everything we did was to support their criminal investigation, the FBI's criminal investigation. And so we would take a look at actuators. We can confirm what the configuration of the airplane was at impact. And we passed this on to the FBI. And quite frankly, we weren't too sure how the FBI was going to use it, but we're not criminal investigators.
Okay, let's move to Shanksville, which is pretty unique. So first off, what strikes everybody is that the plane nosedived and it ended up into small pieces. Have you ever seen other cases like that where the plane nosedives and breaks up in little pieces?
Yes, I did US Air 427 some years before at Pittsburgh, where the airplane had a malfunction of the rudder system and essentially nosedived into a field at 300 miles an hour. And in fact, it was probably a steeper angle in Shanksville. And it was very fragmented. So we've seen this before. We saw an accident with a 737 in Jakarta that very high speed impact. So a lot of fragmentation. So we've seen that before. So looking at the data, yeah, it's what we would expect with a high speed impact with a very steep angle of descent. Shanksville is interesting in that at that point, the criminals decided to end the flight and to crash rather than proceed on out of fear that the passengers would take control of the airplane. But the impact itself was fairly typical of what we've seen in previous investigations.
As far as you can tell, did the airplane start to break apart before hitting the ground because it was going too fast, or did it reach the ground intact?
Everything we saw as the airplane hit the ground intact. We didn't find any parts farther away from the accident site. It wasn't like it was shedding, landing gear doors and other pieces on the way down. It was very fast, but I don't recall any components being found away from the impact zone.
Okay, you guys were also responsible for piecing together the pieces of the airplane. Did anything in particular strike you during this process?
Only that we could tell it was a high-speed impact, obviously. And once again, we did have some data from that event. And we could take a look and see that, important to the NTSB, there were no signs of an aircraft systems failure. The airplane, basically arrived at the accident site intact. All the systems were working correctly. And so from our point of view of aviation safety, there was no safety issues. Everything here were, terrorists doing an intentional act. So once again, we would identify parts for the FBI, we'd help them out there. But from a safety point of view, there was nothing for the NTSB.
Well, I would like to ask you the same question that I asked about the World Trade Center. Also, in this case, the pieces were scattered around over a very large area. Is that common? Have you seen other cases like this?
Yes, we've seen other cases like this. Quite a few. Once again, US Air 427 is scattered like that. We've seen like TW 800 with in-flight breakup. We've seen pieces scattered. So yeah, we've seen in, high speed impacts, the fan distribution of parts after impact. We've seen that before. It just depends on the speed and the angle of impact, how far these parts may go. So from our investigation experience, this was not that untypical, except for the fact it was a criminal intent, which that we hadn't seen before.
Okay, let's move to the Pentagon. You know that there are some folks who say, plane crashed into the Pentagon. Of course, I'm not one of those, but let me ask you this dumb question anyway. What is the most overwhelming evidence that confirms that a plane actually crashed into the Pentagon?
The most overwhelming evidence is all the parts of a Boeing 757 we found there. I mean, it's clearly they weren't trucked in. And so we found lots of airplane parts embedded in the building. The Pentagon is different in that the airplane actually hit short of the building. And so there was a ground impact before it hit the building, which dissipated a fair amount of energy. And at that point, the engines were torn off and some other things happened. And so unlike World Trade Centers, where it was a direct impact to the airplane, here, the airplane had a large impact in the dirt short and started coming apart there and then hit the building. And that first impact reduced the energy level greatly by the time the airplane got to the building. So the damage was much less, comparatively speaking. Had they hit the building directly, it probably would have gone through the building, at least pieces of it, the engines and things like that could have. But hitting short greatly reduced the total energy involved by the time it got to the Pentagon walls.
Okay, what strikes me about this accident is that the biggest damages to the structure of the building were not produced by the hard parts of the airplane, but by the fuel. That being liquid was also uncompressible. Is that normal? Is that a common thing that destroys buildings? Well, actually, there are not many airplane crashes into buildings, but still you get my question.
Yeah, we've seen sort of that before. The fuel hits, and it's almost because the speed and the inertia of it is almost like a solid when it hits there. And so it adds more mass to this impact. And then in the World Trade Center, suddenly after the impact, you have this huge amount of fuel burning that essentially destroyed the structure of the World Trade Center buildings and caused the eventual upper stories to collapse down. But, we have seen kind of hydraulic effects from impacts before with the fuel, hits and rip structure apart and things like that. But what we hadn't seen before was that occurring at such a high speed. These airplanes hadn't gone far since takeoff, so they had a lot of fuel on board still. So the amount of fuel, the speed, the essential, perpendicular impact, all contributed to an incredible amount of damage to those buildings.
Here too, you guys had to piece the plane together. Anything particular in this case that struck you guys?
No, I mean, once we started, piecing it all together, and we'd sort out what we had. We would sort out the actuators, all the pieces, the engines, and start helping out the FBI identify parts. So we did a lot of parts identification for them. Then they could decide what to do with all this wreckage, which, by the way, they still have somewhere in the warehouse. So we would help sort through the parts. We looked at it, looking at the information we had. We were able to say, okay, once again, we don't see any airplane issues. These airplanes were intact and fully functional at the point of impact.
Well, let me ask you something very general. What are the most peculiar aspects of this investigation for the NTSB?
Well, I guess, the most peculiar, we had never before, well, yeah, in the NTSB history, we had never seen a airplane impact a building like this, that not a large airplane. You have to go back almost to the Second World War when a B-25 crashed into the Empire State Building by accident. And that did a lot of damage at that time. And that's a much smaller airplane going a lot slower. So it was unusual in that respect that we had never encountered something like this before. Absolutely. So the amount of destruction to the aircraft, yes, we've seen some very high-speed impacts. We've seen airplanes essentially consumed by fire after an accident, with not much left at all. This combination of building, an airplane, the collapse, everything else, it made it a lot more complex in terms of how we could assist. And also, we're not investigating by NTSB rules, we're investigating by the FBI rules. And so what do they need and how can we support them? So it's a little bit different.
Well, Tom, many thanks for your time. I think it was very important to give also this angle to the 9/11 story, because I think that the NTSB investigation is often overlooked, because people only look at investigations by the police, by the FBI, and by the CIA. But you guys also provided very good effort, very big effort that is too often ignored.
Yeah, we put a lot of manpower into it for that period of time. Of course, it wasn't hard because at that time, every airplane in the United States was grounded. And so we had the staff and we essentially made everybody we had available to support. And I think it worked out well. And it's just incredible it happened. And fortunately, we've seen nothing like that since.
Well, many thanks again for your time, Tom. And thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.